happy to address you today as Chair of Equinet, the European Network of Equality Bodies, as member of Council of Europe's ECRI, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, and as Deputy Ombudswoman of Croatia. The rule of law, fundamental rights, and equality and non-discrimination are fundamental values on which the EU is built. When countries are joining the European Union, as was the experience of Croatia, they are under strict scrutiny regarding the interconnected issues of the rule of law, justice, fundamental rights, non-discrimination, with the European Commission regularly reporting on these, including on the independence of the judiciary, independent institutions, or the fight against corruption. However, paradoxically, once they are members, there is no such monitoring at the level of the EU. In Croatia, for instance, after EU accession, we did witness a certain backsliding in some of these areas, which can, at least in part, be attributed to no longer having Commission reports on these issues, but also to a larger negative global trend marked by threats to independent institutions and a backsliding of rights and freedoms. As negative developments can and do occur in the European Union member states, the new European rule of law mechanism is a very welcome and much needed preventive tool, a part of which will be the first annual rule of law report on developments relating to the rule of law in EU member states. At the national level, there are currently actors which do report on the situation in relation to many of these interconnected issues of rule of law, fundamental rights and equality: civil society, media, and importantly, independent institutions like ombudsmen, national human rights institutions, equality bodies, agencies and commissions working on protecting whistleblowers, safeguarding access to information, or fighting corruption. Their role is to point out issues relating to illegality and corruption, as well as infringements of rights and discrimination, and for that they need to be independent, particularly from the government. In relation to assessing the situation in member states, these independent institutions can have a dual role, as they both monitor and report on the situation, but their own independence, resources and powers provide a good test of the levels of the situation regarding pluralism, democracy and rule of law within a country. Threats to these independent institutions are a serious alarm bell in itself. Moreover, threats to any part of the system of institutions and stakeholders are necessarily also a hurdle for them to fulfill their functions. Aside from threats resulting from the issues of non-independent judiciary, threats to civil society and to the media also endanger key partners and sources of information, thereby limiting their effectiveness even in the absence of measures explicitly targeting them. As Chair of Equinet, the European Network of Equality Bodies, which brings together 49 equality bodies, statutory public institutions which assist victims of discrimination, monitor and report on discrimination issues, and promote equality at the national level, I would like to particularly highlight that in our view it is essential to have strong and properly functioning independent equality bodies, as they are best positioned to safeguard the principle of equality and non-discrimination as envisaged in European Union legislation. The absence or weak status of equality bodies will have a direct negative effect on the rule of law in the country. At the same time, actions undermining the rule of law in the country may also have a direct impact on national equality bodies and their work. When assessing rule of law breaches and the potential impact on national equality bodies, the most important benchmarks to consider are the standards for equality bodies. In 2018, the European Commission adopted a recommendation on standards for equality bodies, setting minimum standards concerning their independence, effectiveness, sufficient resources, appropriate mandate and powers, as well as the national institutional architecture for equality. Another similar set of standards is provided in the Council of Europe's ECRI's revised General Policy Recommendation No. 2 on equality bodies to combat racism and intolerance at national level. I personally had the pleasure to chair the ECRI working group which drafted the revised GPR in 2017, which was later adopted by ECRI plenary, in which we provided detailed standards for the establishment, mandates, independence, effectiveness and accessibility of equality bodies. These standards of independence, effectiveness, sufficient resources, appropriate powers, and what the national architecture should look like, including competences and functions, are also similar to the standards that should apply to all other independent institutions so that they can fulfill their roles. In relation to equality bodies, without ensuring proper standards for equality bodies will be unable to act as watchdogs and safeguard equality and non-discrimination principles. They need to be strengthened because this is a part of the monitoring of the rule of law. The independence of equality bodies must be ensured and protected so that governments introducing non-democratic or arbitrary measures breaching the rule of law do not have negative and limiting effects on the scope of the mandate and work of equality bodies. Their administrative structure should remain independent from elected authorities, and procedures for appointing and dismissing personnel, especially high-ranking officials, should not be influenced by the political power in place or impose a conflict of interest. Additionally, the grounds of discrimination covered by national mandates should not be limited or defined against EU anti-discrimination law due to arbitrary ideologies or extremist pressure groups. The independence of equality bodies is also crucial so that equality bodies cannot be forcefully advised against investigating certain issues and to allow them to continue raising awareness of their work and various issues of equality so that victims of discrimination know where to turn. The independence and effectiveness of equality bodies must also be preserved so that victims of discrimination are able to receive adequate assistance. Moreover, rule of law breaches may also have an impact on another crucial function of equality bodies, providing legal assistance to victims of discrimination. Courts that have lost their independence pose serious risks, as judges subordinated to the government may not be impartial to discrimination and inequality cases, especially when the government has advised against investigating cases on the given issue. This constitutes a serious problem to both victims seeking legal assistance and equality bodies aiming to help provide it. Sufficient resources of equality bodies are also essential to ensure the effectiveness of their work. Budget allocation for equality bodies must remain fair and adequate. Any budget cuts by the government also limits the effectiveness of equality bodies and may be used as a direct or indirect pressure mechanism to hinder its independence. Insufficient resources may result in a decrease of effectiveness of the functioning of the body, not having enough resources to effectively perform all tasks covered by its mandate. All this is, of course, very relevant in these COVID-19 pandemic circumstances, but also in our thinking and planning for the aftermath and the economic crisis ahead. Firstly, looking at the current situation, there is a general risk of equality concerns being seen as a luxury, somehow less important and downgraded in these emergency situations. However, equality is and should be a concern. The current public health care crisis and the measures taken by governments to tackle it are not as neutral as one might expect. They affect some Europeans more than others, with disproportionately negative effects on certain groups, defined, for instance, by their age, ethnic origin, or sex. We must also anticipate a strong socioeconomic crisis, and we must learn from the previous crisis to avoid a full-blown social crisis and a surge in inequalities. An economic downturn and social crisis seem unavoidable over the coming months and years, and this is almost certain to increase discrimination and inequalities without strong pro-equality policies and action at European, national and local levels. That is why equality considerations must be mainstreamed in all EU and national measures, and there is a need to conduct equality impact assessments for all planned actions. It is only by following this path that we can learn from past mistakes and experiences and ensure that no one is left behind. While it is early to judge the impact of the crisis on these, the independence of the equality bodies could be undermined by governments declaring that equality is not a concern in times of crisis, or potentially advising against or effectively stopping investigations on certain issues at times of crisis. The effectiveness of equality bodies could also be undermined with serious, potentially disproportionate budget cuts, as was the case in some countries in the previous crisis around 2008. That is why it is even more important than ever that all member states fully implement the European Commission recommendation on standards for equality bodies. It is in times like these that we must pay particular attention to the importance of independence and effectiveness of equality bodies and all other independent institutions, and to protect them from being undermined or underfunded in the context of the crisis as well as the future ahead of us. The bigger the threats, the bigger the concerns, the more important it is to have independent institutions as watchdogs at the national level, as well as to have a preventive rule of law mechanism at the European level, so that we can all together play our part in ensuring our democracies come out of this crisis strong and resilient, and that the rule of law, fundamental rights and equality remain our common fundamental values which we all uphold. Thank you.